Let's talk about astrology. For literally millions of people, it's this profound guide to life, right? But for the scientific world, well, it's pretty much the textbook case of pseudoscience. So which one is it? Is it a cosmic map to who we are, or is it a system of belief that just doesn't hold up when you really look at it? Let's dive in and find out.
And this, right here, is the heart of the debate. On one hand, you've got an astrologer, Ellen Fahm, calling it an incredibly powerful tool for self-discovery. And on the other, you have the scientific consensus, pretty much summed up by Wikipedia, that has been rejected by the scientific community. I mean, you can't get much farther apart than that. It's like two completely different worlds.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll dive into this tale of two views by mapping out astrology's cosmic DNA, to understand it from the inside out. Then, we're going to see what happens when we put it under the scientific microscope. After that, we'll explore the psychology behind why so many of us believe, and we'll wrap up by asking the biggest question of all. What does it all really mean?
Okay, first up, mapping your cosmic DNA. Look, before we can even start to critique the system, we've got to understand what it is, right? So let's take a look at Western astrology on its own terms, just as its practitioners see it. So the foundational tool here, the whole cornerstone of astrology, is the birth chart. As Alan Fahm puts it, you should think of it like a cosmic map. It's basically a snapshot of the sky at the exact moment you were born. And the whole idea is that this map tells a story about the energies that were in the air and how they might just influence who you are.
So how in the world do you read this map? Well, it really comes down to three key parts. First, you've got the planets. They're the what. They represent different drives inside of us. Then you've got the signs. They're the how. They describe the style or the flavor of that planet's energy. And finally, the houses are the where, pinpointing the exact parts of your life where all this energy shows up.
Now, you've almost certainly heard someone ask, what's your sign? They're talking about your sun sign. But for astrologers, that's just the tip of the iceberg. The real snapshot of you comes from what they call the big three. Your sun sign? That's your core identity, your ego. Your moon sign is all about your inner emotional world, your instincts. And your rising sign? That's your outward personality, kind of like the mask you present to the world.
And this is a perfect example of how the signs add that specific flavor we were talking about. Each one is seen as an archetype with its own vibe. So let's say you have Mars, the planet of action. If it's in Aries, the pioneer, that action is going to be super direct, maybe a little impulsive. But if that same planet is in Taurus, the builder, that exact same drive for action might come out as way more slow, steady, and deliberate. See the difference?
And that brings us to the final piece of this puzzle, the houses. You can think of these as the different stages or arenas of your life where all this cosmic drama plays out. The chart is sliced into 12 sections, and they cover everything, from your sense of self in the first house, to your career in the 10th, to relationships in the 7th. This is the where that gives context to the whole story.
Okay, so that's the system in a nutshell. Now it's time to pivot to our second section, the scientific verdict. Let's see what happens when we really put this whole intricate system to the test.
And this brings us to the absolute crucial question that scientists have been asking for a long time. Does this really complex system of planets and signs and houses, does it actually hold up under investigation? Can any of its claims be proven?
To try and answer that, let's look at one of the most famous studies ever done on astrology. Back in 1985, a physicist named Sean Carlson came up with this really clever double-blind experiment. It was so well designed, in fact, that it got published in Nature, which is one of the most prestigious science journals in the world.
So, what happened? Well, a group of top-tier astrologers were given birth charts, and their task was to match them to anonymous psychological profiles. The result? Their success rate was about 34%, which is basically identical to the 33% you would get just by guessing randomly. The conclusion was pretty stark. Astrology performed no better than pure chance.
And this whole experiment gets at a really core idea in science called falsifiability. It's a concept from the philosopher Karl Popper, and the idea is simple. For any theory to be considered scientific, there has to be some way you could actually prove it's false. You have to be able to test it and see it fail. And this is pretty much where the scientific community lands on this. When you look at the huge body of research, the conclusion is this. Whenever astrology has made specific, testable, falsifiable predictions, it's been falsified. The claims just haven't held up in controlled experiments. And it's not just the failed tests. Scientists also point to some pretty big theoretical problems. For starters, there's no known physical force that could explain how a planet millions of miles away could shape your personality. Then there's something called the precession of the equinoxes, which basically means the zodiac signs we use don't even line up with the constellations they're named after anymore. Oh, and planets like Uranus and Neptune? Astrology didn't predict them. They were just kind of added in after astronomers found them.
So if the scientific evidence just isn't there, why is astrology so incredibly popular? I mean, it's more popular than ever. And that brings us to our third section, the psychology of belief. Or, in other words, why we look to the stars.
Okay, a huge piece of this puzzle is a fascinating psychological quirk called the Barnum effect. It's our natural tendency to read vague, general statements and think, wow, that is so me. It's so accurate. It's named after P.T. Barnum, you know, the circus guy, for his famous "a little something for everyone" style.
Just listen to this statement. You have a great deal of unused capacity, which you have not turned to your advantage. Does that sound like you? Because it sounds a bit like everyone. This is a classic Barnum statement. It feels incredibly personal, but it's actually so general it could apply to almost anyone on the planet.
And working right alongside the Barnum effect is something called confirmation bias. This one is super common. It's our brain's tendency to notice, remember, and focus on information that confirms what we already believe, and to just completely ignore anything that contradicts it. So if your horoscope says you'll meet someone interesting and you do, you remember it. If the 10 other predictions that week fall flat, you just kind of forget about it. All right, let's bring these two different worlds, the believers and the skeptics, back together for our final section. This is all about a question of meaning, and really two totally different ways of seeing the world.
In the end, it really feels like we're left with two fundamentally different ways of looking at astrology. For people who believe in it, it's not really about hard scientific fact. It's more of a rich symbolic language, a tool for self-reflection, for finding meaning. But from the scientific viewpoint, it's a pseudoscience. It's a belief system that just doesn't meet the standards of evidence.
And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. What are we really looking for when we turn to a system like this? Are we searching for verifiable facts that explain the world around us? Or are we looking for a system of meaning to help explain our place in it? And maybe the biggest question of all is, where do we find our story? In the stars or in ourselves?